Now that we have a solid model for elasticity of supply, I want to talk about an application of when elasticity of supply might matter. Now, just like with elasticity of demand, it's going to turn out in chapter 6 that how flat or steep the supply curve is going to have an impact on, when you tax a market, how much of that burden falls on the sellers. And when you subsidize a market, how much of that benefit is captured by the sellers relative to the buyers. But for this lecture series, I'm going to focus on a different application. And that is the application of non-government organizations redeeming slaves in slave markets in Africa. So if you read your textbook, they've got a section on this. They talk about nonprofit organizations in, I want to say, South Sudan, although it could be a different country, but I believe it's in the Sudan. That country has struggled with a significant modern slavery problem, where local warlords under civil war conditions might invade a village, capture some people, and then sell those people to others within the country or maybe outside of the country to be slaves. Now, the model that these non-government organizations have followed is to gather money, raise money in the West, go into countries like Sudan, purchase slaves, but then redeem them in the sense that they just set them free. They obviously don't keep them enslaved. Now, I remember I was an undergraduate when I first heard about these programs, and at the time that made me think, you know what? I'm not so sure that's going to work so well, because when you buy more slaves, you're increasing demand for slaves, and so you very well might perpetuate the very problem that you are trying to eliminate. And it turns out that an analysis of elasticity of supply in that market is crucial in determining whether that approach is going to work, or if you would have to end slavery by some other means, either through moral suasion or through maybe military campaigns or something similar. All right, so let's go through it. There's basically going to be 3 scenarios that we're going to analyze, and they're going to go from being the most friendly to the approach of purchasing and redeeming slaves to the least friendly environment for doing that. So the 3 scenarios are going to be when the supply curve is perfectly inelastic, when the supply curve has some positive elasticity, and then on the next sheet, the supply curve will be perfectly elastic. It'll just be a straight line. A straight horizontal line. So let's start with this case where supply is perfectly inelastic. If the supply of slaves in the market was perfectly inelastic, then what that would tell us is the quantity would be fixed right here. I'll call that quantity Q bar. Okay, there's nobody else out there who could be enslaved in this market, or if those people exist, it's not feasible for warlords to go out and kidnap them and bring them into the market. So there's just a fixed quantity of people. Okay, now this demand curve is sort of what you might think of as the domestic demand within Sudan to purchase slaves in the market, and that is going to result in some equilibrium price. Okay, we'll just call that price P. Now, the approach that the non-governmental organizations, the NGOs, are following is come into this market and start competing with these buyers to purchase slaves. Now, what that would look like is an increase in demand, right? This is just the domestic demand. When the NGOs come in and start purchasing slaves for redemption, that's going to shift this demand curve up and to the right. So let's show that shift right here. Let's say they shift the demand curve out to that point. I'm going to call that demand curve D prime. All right. Now remember, my initial intuition when I heard about this was, well, if you increase demand, you're probably just going to increase the equilibrium quantity of people sold in that market. Turns out that if the supply curve is perfectly inelastic, that's not true. all that's going to happen is you're going to push the price up, but the quantity is fixed, so it's not going to increase the quantity of people enslaved. So the price will go up to there, P prime. Okay. Now, what does this mean? What happens? Well, the price has gone up as a result of that extra competition in the market. And now if you want to see how many people are remaining in slavery, what you have to do is take that price and go back to the original demand curve, because these people are still in the market, right? These domestic buyers are still in here. These are kind of the bad guys that want to purchase the slaves and force them to work for them. Okay, well, how many slaves will they still be able to purchase once the price is that high? Well, you will have competed out these domestic buyers right here, so that the new quantity of people who remain in slavery is going to be here, Q prime. And this, the distance between the original quantity and the new equilibrium quantity, well, not the new equilibrium quantity, but the original quantity and the quantity where the new price hits the bad guy's demand curve, that's the number of people who are being effectively set free by the NGOs. So in this perfect case scenario for them, they're able to push the price up, reduce the number of people who are purchased by the bad guys, and set the rest of those folks free. Okay, so they can do some good in this case. Now, what about this second case here where the supply curve is upward sloping? What this means is that there is not a fixed set of people. There's not a fixed quantity of slaves, and the market is unable to expand. In this case, if the price of slaves goes up, then warlords are going to respond rationally to that by going out and kidnapping more people and bringing them to the market. Okay, this is probably a more realistic scenario than this scenario over here. So let's start with our initial equilibrium price and quantity. So you've got the original quantity Q, I'll call that QE, the original equilibrium quantity. The original price, I'll call that PE. And now, once again, when the NGOs enter the market and start competing with again, I'll call them the bad guys who are trying to keep these folks enslaved, that's going to result in shifting this demand curve up and to the right. So we'll have the same shift here as we had over there. Demand curve shifts right to D prime. And now that is going to affect the equilibrium price and quantity. I'll call that QE prime. Call this PE prime. Okay. Now, in this second scenario, the NGOs have been they've been successful in pushing the price up in this market, just like they were successful over here. However, because the supply curve is upward sloping, that has brought more people into the slave markets. The warlords have responded by capturing additional people. Does that mean that it is completely hopeless in this situation, that they're doing no good? Well, it's more ambiguous than over here, but you could still possibly make the argument that they're doing some good. Why? Because when you take this new higher equilibrium price and you plug it into the original demand curve, the bad guy demand curve, it turns out that the number of people who are remaining in slavery is actually going down to, let's just call it, I'll put an R there. That's the quantity of people remaining in slavery. Okay, now, notice what's going on. As before, you've got, originally you had, here was the reduction in the number of people remaining in slavery. You still have that. There is a reduction in the number of people remaining in slavery in this scenario, but notice that it's a smaller number of people who are being freed and staying free than it was over here. So you can point to that and you can say, aha, they're doing some good. However, there is a trade-off, which is that because the price has gone up, additional people are being enslaved, and so you have this second group of people. These are people who spend some time in captivity. Their village is invaded, they are kidnapped, they are sold on the slave market, but then they are set free, right? They're purchased by the NGOs and set free. These folks' life would have been better if they had never been kidnapped in the first place, so they do bear a cost. These folks, their life is pretty much unambiguously improved by the NGOs because these people would have remained in slavery indefinitely, but they were set free by the NGOs. Okay, so here it's more ambiguous. Last scenario. What if supply is perfectly elastic? In other words, no matter, just increase the price by an infinitesimal amount, and suppliers will can instantly respond to that by capturing many, many, many more slaves. Okay, that's the worst case scenario for the NGOs, and let's see how that works out. So here you have a fixed price, P bar. The original equilibrium, you've got an equilibrium quantity. I'll call it QE again. Now the NGOs come into the market and they bid up demand. And they push the market to this new equilibrium. QE prime. Okay. All right. Now, as before, when you want to find out how many people have been set free by this policy, by this action, what you do is you take the new price, which in this case is the same as the old price, you plug it into the old demand curve, and you find out how many people are still, spending their life in slavery. Well, it turns out that since the supply curve is so flat, shifting demand up does not affect the price at all. And so since you can't force the bad guys to pay a higher price for slaves than they were paying before, you're not going to reduce the number of people that they hold in captivity. So there is no net effect on the number of people in captivity. You've done no good for any of the people who were originally being held. And in addition to that, this is going to be a group of people who spend some amount of time in captivity. Because demand increases in this market, that encourages warlords to go out and find more people and capture them and bring them into this market. Well, this is going to be those people who spend some extra time, not some extra time, they spend some time in captivity when, if the NGOs had just stayed out, those folks never would have been kidnapped in the first place. Okay, so in this scenario, that's the worst case scenario. There's no good being done at all. It's only negative impacts on the people who are in or could be brought into the slave market. Now, which of those scenarios is the reality? Well, it turns out if you look at the price data in those markets over time, It looks like originally you're in one of these two scenarios. In other words, the market price for slaves in Sudan did go up immediately following the entrance of the NGOs into those markets. Okay. Problem is, remember that one of the determinants of supply elasticity is the time frame over which we are looking. So a longer time horizon flattens this supply curve out because the sellers have more time to adjust their behavior to changes in the price. And so, yes, initially the price did go up, so there probably were at least some people who were being redeemed out of this market who wouldn't have been before. But eventually, prices came back down to their old equilibrium level. It looks like, unfortunately, those slave markets had a long run supply curve that was pretty close to perfectly elastic. So that, again, unfortunately, the NGOs were not effective in their purpose. And in order to end those types of markets, again, you're going to need some kind of either moral force of moral suasion across the populace of would-be buyers in those markets, and or you're going to need some kind of force that just closes the markets down and doesn't allow them to continue to operate, similar to what happened in the U.S. Civil War or what happened in the United Kingdom with the passage of banning the slave trade. So that is it for elasticity of supply. As you can see, the idea of how steep this curve might be could sound rather dry or unimportant, but it turns out that there are some very critical matters that we need to know about the supply elasticity in those markets in order to make good and moral decisions.